It was literally September 11th at 9 o'clock in the morning. I was supposed to brief the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do if a bioterrorism event happened, technology-wise. Clearly, I didn't get to give that briefing because 8:34 a.m. the world changes.
Welcome to BMC's Digital Outliers, a podcast series where some of our industry's brightest minds examine the many ways digital technology is transforming the modern workplace, and how companies can find the right blueprint to successfully become digital powerhouses. In this episode, Brian speaks with David Bray, Chief Information Officer for the FCC, about his ambitious and ultimately successful efforts to digitally transform one of the government's most important regulatory bodies, and how the lessons learned in that process can help other business and organizational leaders do the same.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are exploring the future of work. We're exploring conversations around innovation. We're talking about the future of digital transformation and the roles involved in bringing about the future of business in a digital economy. And with us today is Dr. David Bray, Chief Information Officer at the FCC, and also a Harvard executive in residence. Welcome to the show, David, and tell us about all the cool things that you're working on these days.
Thanks for having me, Brian. And really what I'm trying to do at the Federal Communications Commission is take an organization that when I arrived in August of 2013 had 207 different systems, average age more than 10 years old, all on premise, essentially was probably at least a decade behind the times. And within 2.5 years, we now have nothing on premise. We either went straight to public cloud or commercial service provider. And in the progress of doing that, we gained a few things. One, instead of spending 85% or more of our budget to maintain those systems, it's now less than 50%. Two, now where in the past, if you came to us and you asked us to do a new system or a modification to an existing system, that probably took at least 6 months and probably 9 months or more. Now when you come to us, in less than 48 hours, we can have a working prototype for you. And then finally, what we're really trying to do is empower what I would call positive change agents throughout the organization, so that IT is not something that's done by a select few, but really it's recognizing that everybody has a role in digital, everybody has a role in stepping outside of the status quo, and that we need the entire organization to do that.
Wow. Any organization that's gone through this amount of change, regardless of the industry, is pretty profound. I have so many questions already going off script. What does reinforcing positive change agents look like? I mean, because what we're talking about just right out of the gate is something that's typically in an organization tightly held with the clenched fist, even in IT, that anything related to technology. The notion that sort of spreading or democratizing digital advancement across the organization is fascinating. Explain that a little bit more, and how did you get there?
So a little bit about how I ended up at the FCC without going too far back. I was crazy enough to start working for government when I was 15. They approached me. I was good with computer simulations and ended up working at a physics lab where they accelerated electron beams, writing computer simulations, and then later worked for the Department of Defense with small satellites. Along the way, spent some time in the private sector with Microsoft and Yahoo in the late 90s. And then in 2000, signed up for what was called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program at the Centers for Disease Control. I thought I'd do it for about 3 or 4 years and then, I don't know, maybe join the Peace Corps. What we were there for was if a really bad day happened. Because if you remember, there had been the sarin gas attacks that had happened in the 1990s. There were other things involving concerns about smallpox. A couple of things, though. One, every 6 months, we were told we were a Cold War relic that did not need to exist. And then two, if you remember, the Agile Manifesto came out in March of 2001. And what was that? It was the manifesto, the idea that we don't need to do waterfall development, that we need to do agile development. And that is the idea that you can do rapid sprints and if need to, adjust, pivot as requirements change. And so I was actually, I guess, a bit of a maverick because I was trying to advocate agile development at the Centers for Disease Control for our program because we did not have 5 years to wait for solutions to bioterrorism preparedness to come online. I was told to get back in my box. I was told to buy into the 5-year program. And I said, well, we don't have a deal with the terrorists as to when they're going to strike, honestly. And it was literally September 11th at 9 o'clock in the morning. I was supposed to brief the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do if a bioterrorism event happened, technology-wise. Clearly, I didn't get to give that briefing because 8:34 a.m. the world changes. We piled computers into cars, didn't sleep for 3 weeks, dealing with the response to 9/11. So down on October 1st, I gave the briefing I was supposed to give on October 3rd, and 24 hours later, the first case of anthrax shows up. Fortunately, because of agile development, because of actually stepping outside of the box and actually doing things beyond the status quo, we did have solutions that allowed us to do web tracking across the entire country. We saw millions of environmental samples from anthrax being done. But that showed me that you need to embrace a bottoms-up approach to responding to any type of changing environment. A top-down one will be out of date. That was back in 2001. I've had a series of interesting adventures since then. But when I parachuted into the FCC, I wanted to make sure I did not become that top-down, tightly guarded chief information officer that was trying to impose my view of the world onto the rest of the organization. Because really, the edges of the organization know their mission context well. They know what's required. And so it's really working with them in partnership, almost like an internal venture capitalist, such that anybody can come in and say, here's an idea I have. And I'll ask them, give me 3 reasons why we should do it. But even more importantly, give me 3 reasons why we should not do that. Because in public service, we have constraints. We have, our funding's not set by the organizations, it's set by Congress. The laws that we have to obey are not set by the organizations, they're again set by Congress. And then the final step I ask of them is give me how we're going to mitigate those reasons why we should not do something. And if they have that plan, and I'll work with them if they don't, but if they have a plan that gets to the point where they can tell those 3 why we should do it, why we shouldn't, and how we're going to mitigate the friction, then I'm willing to invest in them. And we'll see what they can do in 3 months. If it proceeds past that, 6 months. But it's almost like operating like a venture capitalist on the inside, because the reality is, how people talk about digital business or becoming a digital business. Digital is everybody nowadays. I mean, the internet is pervasive. Everybody has the opportunity to be a change agent if they're willing to step outside of the status quo and have a strategy for mitigating the friction.
This is a theme that has come up in every conversation. In fact, the words like entrepreneur, maverick, agile, challenging convention and status quo. I would love to hear your advice on this. In many organizations, exactly what you described is this sort of desired state. To get there is incredibly complicated and political and very human, I guess, to say the least. How would somebody listening to this, say they're the CIO or they're a CMO or they're just somebody who believes in the potential of digital and really fighting to bring about change and perspective in the organization? How do you get there? How do you get those conversations going?
You hit the nail on the head when saying it's a very human endeavor. I often say my job is at least 80%, if not 90% human, and probably only 10% technology. So to give you a bit of perspective, the average person at the FCC when I arrived had been there for 15 and a half years. The average contractor had been at the FCC actually for 19 years. And when I parachuted in, there had already been 9 CIOs in 8 years, which is always a great sign for the 10th CIO showing up on the job. Right. Now, fortunately, that was back in August of 2013, so I guess I'm approaching 3 years, so I guess I have gone beyond the average. But I'm sure when I arrived, they were all looking at their watches saying, why should we listen to this individual? What's going to make them any different than the other 9 people we've had in 8 years pass through this role? And the first thing I was very intentional about doing was taking the time to listen to the existing narratives in the organization. I think that is so key. Where basically I was saying, I'll be available between the hours of 10:30 and 12. There are some snacks if you want to come. Stop by, don't have to be scheduled, and just tell me what you think is going on. What are we doing well? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities and threats? And at the same time, I also purposely made a very large poster that anybody could write on, again, asking that same question of just stop by, write on this, and put down our strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats. And this was not just for IT, this was for the entire organization. I found a few things. One, FCC has 18 different bureaus and offices, and no surprise, you've seen one bureau and office, you've just seen one bureau and office. They each have their own different organizational subcultures, and you need to know that if you're going to navigate that landscape. 2, however, I found that people were much more comfortable apparently emailing me their thoughts than actually going on a board and writing it or sharing them in public, which I thought was very curious. That was the first thing that told me something was up or odd here. And apparently some of my predecessors were trying to be like Steve Jobs and would publicly shout at people as to why they were wrong. And so that created a culture in which nobody felt empowered to share their views. Quite frankly, for public service, you're probably not doing it for the chance of an IPO. There is no IPO, as far as I know, in public service, although it would be interesting. And so if you take away the ability for people to have a voice of what they're hearing and what they're seeing, even if you possibly disagree, don't be surprised if no one will back your movement of change. If you take away the ability for people to have a voice of what they're hearing and what they're seeing, don't be surprised if no one will back your movement of change. Because really what you're trying to do is begin to cultivate a movement of change. Then the next thing I did was about 3 or 4 months into the role, aside from beginning to identify by listening to people what were reoccurring problems, what was sort of almost like the theory of the case. I often see my job as Sherlock Holmes, and you're trying to solve a mystery, except it's many different mysteries, and you're trying to figure out who did it, how it can be fixed, things like that. I put forward sort of a vision that was using the existing narratives and slightly tweaking them. So that way I could get buy-in. But then two, I said, we are the Federal Communications Commission. We should not be 10 years behind the time with our technology internally. We should be leading the way. And as audacious it was to say that back in 2013, that was me beginning to plant my flag and hopefully begin to get people to rally. About 3 or 4 months in, I asked people, how do you think we're doing? And it was at an all-hands meeting. And I was just going to listen for an hour. The only thing I could do was ask questions. I couldn't impose my own views. And people were hesitant at first to volunteer, but I called on a few people and said, well, what do you think? It became clear that 3 or 4 months in, 10 to 15% were very much excited about the idea that in 2 years we could potentially go from being laggards to being early adopters and leading the way, at least for public service. But another 40 to 45%, quite frankly, were uncertain and were candid enough to tell me they were waiting to see if I would still be here a month later. And then the remaining percentage, quite frankly, wanted to go back to the way things were. So that was 3 or 4 months in. I did that about every 6 months, asking people how we were doing. Another 6 months, we were up to 35%. Another 6 months, we were now at 55%, so we were past the tipping point. By late 2015, I asked how we were doing, and 85% said they were extremely excited about where we were going.
It's one thing to get people to rally around the cause, which is a tremendous effort. And takes a different style of, I won't use the word management, but leadership. What happens, though, in the situation where people might rally, but maybe they're anchored by legacy expertise or perspectives? How do you get them to come along?
The reality is I think any change effort like this, if you're the CEO, you have to have the buy-in of the board. If you're another C-suite executive, you have to have a buy-in from your chief executive officer and the board. But you have to have champions. You can't go it alone. But I said to the entire organization, there's a difference between leadership and management. Management is when we do what's expected of us. And we all need to do that to a degree or we're quickly out of a job. That said, leadership is when you intentionally step outside of expectations. And in fact, leadership comes from the Greek word leet, which means to be sent unto death. Back in ancient Greece, the leets were the ones that would carry the flag in front of the melee army. And that's all well and good until one melee army meets another melee army. And guess who's the first to die? The leets. And so if you're going to be asked to be a leader, you may be being sent unto death. Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment as a leader was actually when he had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and ask them to make peace with the white minority in South Africa. They didn't really want to do that, and they almost had a coup.
You're listening to BMC's Digital Outliers, a series dedicated to helping you understand the many ways digital technology is transforming the modern workplace. To listen to other podcasts in this series, go to digitaloutliers.com.
Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, when he actually turned to his own Israeli supporters and said, we're going to make peace with the Palestinians, unfortunately was assassinated by an Israeli. And so leaders need to be aware of that they're stepping outside of expectations, they are being sent unto death, and they need to have a strategy for hopefully not actually dying or metaphorically dying. So I was broadcasting early on that I was going to have a resistat that sometimes I would be meeting expectations of either my board, my champions, or of the partners in the organization, or even my team. But other times I would be stepping outside of those expectations, and they should know that. At the same time, I also asked them all to possibly be change agents and that they would be willing to step outside of the status quo. My only ask is if they're going to step outside of expectations to have a strategy for that, how you're going to manage the friction. So You're absolutely right. What happens when people get rallied and they get enthused, but they're still burdened? One of our biggest challenges was the fact that most of the people at the FCC knew how to do client server, and I was saying we wanted to go to public cloud. And so there was some fear about what would be my job going forward. So I had to broadcast early on saying, for everyone who is a positive change agent, we will help you address the new skills needed for your new role. That's not something you have to worry about. In fact, this is an opportunity to learn the latest and greatest. At the same time, I also was very intentional about, for the government employees, to take a time to meet with each of them individually and ask them a question, which was, what brings you joy? Which might be an odd question for a chief information officer to be asking. However, I think it's key because the reality is we all generally want to take some joy or find some purpose in our work. And by asking that question, you're helping the person reflect on why are they here? And what do they want to get out of their work? And then you're also hearing from them when they answer that question, what they are really passionate about. So if I can align something that I need done with something that someone indicates brings some joy and they're passionate about, they're going to now be intrinsically motivated to tackle it. Finally, however, we did have to address the fact that there were a lot of contractors at the FCC. And by saying we wanted to go to public cloud and we wanted to go to commercial service provider, they realized that we may not need the same amount of on-site contractors that we used to have. There were some incumbent contractors that, quite frankly, were kind of resistant to change. They were trying to whisper in the ears of both the IT experts in the organization, but also in the bureaus and offices that this is crazy, we should keep everything on-premise. So one, I would be very public about discussing this and saying, if you have concerns, let's talk about it, let's get on the table, because they may have some valid points. I'm a big believer that all leaders have blind spots. And I tell my team, I reward people that point out my blind spots. That said, we did have an incident where one of the contractors was trying to help their parent company recognize that things were going to change at the FCC. They needed to adopt cloud. And they waited until New Year's Eve at 3 p.m. in the afternoon to fire the person. And that was their choice to shoot the messenger. However, I went to that individual and I said, I can't offer you a government role, but I can offer you what's called a short-term consultant role, which is only 6 months. You don't get any additional benefits. However, you would have a chance to be on the government side representing us as we work on this effort. And that person was willing to say yes, such that a week later, after New Year's Eve, I was able to meet with the contractors and say, we now have a new government person in charge of this effort. Some of you might know who this person is. And that person walked in, and of course, their eyes got very big. So you need to be benevolent, but you also need to be both competent and operate with integrity and be wise to the fact that you are moving people's cheeses, and some may actively try to resist that.
How do we get the C-suite on board with this type of change in these situations where you can't? What do you do about it?
Anyone seeking to be a champion of change agents needs to first figure out what is the sense of urgency I can instill that indicates why we must change. I'm a big believer, I think it was the philosopher Hobbes who pointed out that people aren't prone to change when they're happy. And I'd go even one step further. Unless they're significantly unhappy, they will not change. So identify why should we expend the energy and the effort to change, and why in particular is what you're proposing the effective strategy that will be the reason to do it. And so that's the same thing I ask of my team, which is why should we do this? Why shouldn't we do this? And how are we going to mitigate those reasons why not? Two, however, you can't go it alone. You have to begin to build a network within the organization of other sort of supporters that are beginning to rally behind the cause. And you can do that again through holding breakfast sessions on your own, having happy hours outside of work, but begin to identify a network across the organization of different perspectives. One, because then it's not just you. And in some respects, this will help keep you sane when you're banging your head against a wall, that you're not the only one trying to do change. But then two, the network that you cultivate can actively help you identify blind spots before you go too far. If it's just you, you may keep on going further and further out on the ice, and people may be saying go for it or not even stopping you. And before you know it, you've gone out so far on the ice that the ice is now cracked and you've fallen into the frozen water. But if it's a network, someone might say, I know what you just said, however, let me give you this different perspective or why I think it might not be a good idea. And you want that early warning network to let you know. One of the things I did at the FCC was I launched what I called intrapreneurs, which are essentially entrepreneurs on the inside, which were dedicated representatives from my team to each of the different bureaus and offices that could be there to basically learn the different narratives and dialogues and concerns going on in those offices. One of the things I did at the FCC was I launched what I called intrapreneurs, which are essentially entrepreneurs on the inside. In fact, my one ask of them is that I could go to them at any time and I could ask them, what are the top 5 concerns of your bureau and office? And what are the top 5 things that we're doing about it? And that to me would be a sign of success. The other thing was I gave them 3 things, which was I gave them autonomy. So they didn't always have to come to me to get approval to do something. 2, I gave them the ability to measure progress, which you might think was only an advantage to me. However, psychology shows that if you can see the progress you're making, that motivates you to go even further. It's why we play video games where we accumulate points and things like that, is that people like to see measurable progress at work. And then finally, I gave them a meaningful purpose. So this wasn't just doing something technology-wise or something like this. This was about the mission. It was tying it back to the mission of their specific bureau and office, and that was key. So I think if you really want to create change, you have to recognize it's got to be a network effect instilled by powerful narratives, a sense of urgency, and then also recognizing that you will have blind spots and you'll need to learn along the way.
In many ways, the traditional role of a CIO almost seems like you couldn't be further from it. And I'm curious, though, because in one conversation I had with someone whom I greatly admire, he believes that the role of the CIO is going away. And just hearing about how you're approaching change and your work, you sound almost like you're creating a role in motion. So what would you say to what your role is and what the future role of the CIO should be?
If people ask me to describe what I am, I say I'm really a near impossible mission leader. I get motivated. If someone tells me it's never been done before or it's impossible or it's been tried so many times and failed, that gets me up in the morning. And I think that's going to be needed in the increasing frequency of CIOs or chief digital officers or chief management officers or chief marketing officers. I mean, there's so many. C-suite cannot maintain the status quo. Our world is changing exponentially. Just last year, there were 14 billion network devices on the face of the planet for only 7 billion people, to anywhere between 50 billion on up in just 4 years. That's not linear change, that's exponential change. The amount of data on the face of the planet is doubling every year, such that by the time we get to 2022, less than 6 years away, there will be more digital data than all human eyes see in the course of the year. To 9.6 billion versions of the Library of Congress will be out there. And so that is going to strain all organizations, public and private. It is going to strain all the C-suite roles. And if we don't figure out a way to move forward with adaptive leadership, organizations will go bankrupt or they'll lose public trust. What's needed are people that are motivated by the fact that we have to figure out how to both change but bring along organizations, because we all can't be startups. I mean, startups, yes, they don't have the burden of legacy. They don't have legacy technology. They don't have legacy infrastructure, values, vision, things like that. But if everything was a startup, quite frankly, I'm not sure everything would work. I mean, I know at least in the public sector, the last thing you want is the Department of Defense to operate like a startup, because they would say, sorry, it didn't work out. We need to run the venture capital funding. That would be bad. And similarly, even a startup today, given the amount of exponential change in 5 years, will be out of date. And so this to me raises very interesting questions about where we're going. Quite frankly, I actually wonder whether or not we can continue to do representative democracy successfully 10 years from now, or if things are changing so quickly, eroding public trust, that it's making people favor, even though they're not articulating it. It seems like people seem to be wanting something that's more either like an oligarchy or monarchy, and I'm very worried about that. That's why I remain in public service. Is I'm a big believer that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that one of the brilliant insights of our founders were to establish a system of checks and balances. And that in some respects slows things down to a degree. And that may be the challenge we're facing in the exponential era, is how do we move with speed and still have checks and balances that preserve privacy, civil liberties, individual freedoms. I look forward to tackling that. I would say for CIOs, you need to have a frank conversation with your board, with your chief executive officer, and saying, look, this idea that digital business is something unique. I mean, what part of your business do you not want to be digital going forward? And so how do we empower everyone in the organization to have a role in that, whether they've got the actual expertise or not, whether they've got deep insights or not? In fact, there is research that shows you want naive participants, because just experts alone fall into the trap of groupthink. And actually, when you have new participants plus experienced participants, that will beat just a group of experts. So having that conversation about how do we move forward, what are we going to do as an organization, as a business, as an organization, And then how can whatever you call them, chief information officer or whatever the new title is, how can they be the catalyst to make sure that the organization is always learning, always adapting to the turbulent environments outside?
Dr. David Bray, thank you so much for being on the show. I've learned so much and thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I hope it's not our last.
Thank you, Brian. I hope to do it again. Truly appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to BMC's Digital Outliers, a series dedicated to sharing the changes the modern workplace is undergoing via digital technology. BMC Software is a global leader that partners with companies committed to becoming digital powerhouses. Follow us on Twitter at BMC Software and at BMC_DSM.